There was a time when the campaign wasn't a feature. It was the reason you bought the game. You didn't log in. You didn't check daily challenges. You stepped into a world designed to end. Halo made you feel like humanity's last hope. Modern warfare turned war into spectacle. Mass Effect let you decide the fate of civilizations. For a few unforgettable years, single-player campaigns were optional. They were the main event. So how did the main event become a side mode? In the early 2000s, campaigns defined value. Box art didn't advertise battle passes, it promised stories. When you bought a shooter, you expected narrative progression, handcrafted missions, scripted pacing. Multiplayer existed, but it extended the experience. It didn't replace it. Halo didn't just introduce competitive maps, it built mythos. Call of Duty 4 didn't just simulate firefights, it orchestrated cinematic tension, using tightly scripted sequences, controlled pacing and dramatic framing, borrowed directly from film. Developers weren't optimizing for time spent, they were designing for impact. Campaigns had arcs, escalation, resolution, and when the credits rolled, it felt finished. That sense of completion mattered, because at the time, games were still largely product-based, not platform-based. You bought an experience, you finished it, you remembered it, but success creates escalation, and escalation creates pressure. Between 2007 and 2012, the campaign became prestige. Budgets expanded into tens of millions. Studios hired Hollywood actors. Motion capture pipelines matured. The goal was no longer just good gameplay, it was immersion. BioShock didn't just tell a story, it embedded ideology into level design. Mass Effect didn't just offer dialogue, it created persistent consequence across sequels, something technically and narratively ambitious. Uncharted turned scripted sequences into playable cinema, and the audience responded. Campaign launches were dissected like film premieres. Forums debated endings for weeks. Memorable scenes became cultural shorthand. But beneath the spectacle, production costs were rising rapidly. High-fidelity campaigns required scriptwriting teams, performance capture sessions, cinematic animation pipelines, custom-level scripting, voice direction, and QA for branching sequences. And unlike multiplayer, none of it scaled after release. A campaign sold the box, but it didn't extend monetization, and that tension was building. Around the early 2010s, the economics of the industry transformed. Broadband was standard, digital storefronts matured, Xbox Live and PlayStation Network normalized online ecosystems, and publishers began analyzing engagement metrics at scale. The numbers were clear. The average player finished only a fraction of the campaign, but they spent hundreds of hours in multiplayer. From a business perspective, that changed everything. Campaign development was front-loaded cost. Multiplayer was recurring revenue. Map packs became seasonal models. Seasonal models became microtransactions. Microtransactions became live service ecosystems. Suddenly, post-launch monetization could exceed initial sales revenue. A tightly scripted 8-hour campaign could not compete with the multiplayer mode that retained players for years. So, priorities shifted. Not publicly, not dramatically, but structurally. Campaign budgets were scrutinized. Development teams were reallocated. Resources followed projected lifetime value. And design philosophy followed resource allocation. The question wasn't, are campaigns good? It was, are they sustainable at scale? That's a different conversation. The turning point wasn't one announcement, it was accumulation. Call of Duty Black Ops 4 launched without a traditional campaign. Battlefield emphasized multiplayer spectacle over narrative cohesion. Titanfall prioritized competitive innovation. Individually, these were design decisions. Collectively, they signaled a pivot. Linear storytelling carried high cost and low retention metrics. Live service multiplayer carried lower marginal cost and compounding engagement. Even when campaigns returned, they became shorter. More tightly scripted, less experimental. Risk tolerance narrowed, because branching narrative experimentation didn't guarantee return on investment. Multiplayer cosmetics did. It wasn't creative failure, it was financial optimization. But financial optimization changes culture. And for players who grew up finishing campaigns on weekend marathons, something felt lost. Not because multiplayer was bad, but because the center of gravity moved. The It would be convenient to call this a decline, but that oversimplifies it. Campaign storytelling didn't vanish, it shifted platforms. Sony's first-party strategy became narrative prestige. The Last of Us, God of War, Horizon. These weren't side modes, these were flagship investments. Meanwhile, RPGs deepened narrative complexity. The Witcher 3, Cyberpunk 2077, Baldur's Gate 3. The blockbuster military campaign narrowed, but the prestige narrative game expanded elsewhere. What disappeared wasn't single-player storytelling, it was the assumption that every AAA shooter required one. The golden era was unique because narrative ambition and multiplayer ambition coexisted inside the same box. That alignment became economically inefficient, and efficiency rarely survives scale. Today, campaigns still launch, but they carry different weight. Sometimes they're nostalgia-driven returns, sometimes prestige showcases, sometimes legacy expectations, but they are no longer the authentic centerpiece of major shooters. And yet, when a campaign truly resonates, the industry pays attention. Because storytelling still differentiates. Multiplayer drives retention, but narrative builds memory. Retention keeps players engaged. Story keeps them attached, and attachments is harder to quantify. Maybe that's why the golden era feels singular, because for a brief window, business incentives and creative ambition aligned. Campaigns were profitable, multiplayer was supplemental, budgets were ambitious, audiences were unified. That combination is rare, and rarity creates nostalgia. There was a time when the campaign wasn't a feature, it was the reason. You bought the game, you cleared your weekend, you followed the story to its final frame. Not to unlock skins, not to grind tiers, but to experience something crafted with an ending in mind. The golden era of single-player campaigns didn't collapse. It recalibrated. Economic gravity shifted the center, but the memory remains, because completion leaves an imprint. And for a few unforgettable years, finishing the story felt like finishing the game. This archive remains open. New case files release every Monday, Wednesday and Friday.